So I got to admit, this review could have gone in two very different directions. I could have tried to unpack every single feature that Radio Shack threw up inside of this thing, which I don't know, would have taken somewhere between 4 to 48 weeks. Or I could just focus on a couple of standout features, show how they work, and cut this review down to, I don't know, however long this review ends up being. So yeah, let's do that. Welcome back to New Record Day. My name is Ron. If you consider yourself an audiophile or a music enthusiast, welcome home. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and the bell notification so you know when the next video drops. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the Outlaw RR2160 MKII, and yes, this serves as the official ethics statement. Outlaw sent me this unit to review, but somehow forgot to send me a bunch of moolah to say nice things about it. In other words, and jokes aside, all my thoughts and opinions are my own, and no, there have been no conversations about keeping this amplifier or any other monkey business. So yeah, nothing to hide here, just my take on what this thing does, how it sounds, and whether or not you should give a hill of beans. And with that, let's go. The 2160 is a Class AB integrated amplifier that has more bells and whistles that you can shake a stick at. Taking a peek at the front panel, which has a cool retro vibe, you will find a standby button, a dedicated headphone circuit with a level control, and a 3.5mm aux input on the bottom left side of the amplifier. Just to the right of this section, there's an AB speaker selector, speaker EQ, external loop, and a USB jack. Above this, you will find a button for activating tone controls with bass, balance, and treble dials just to the right. On the far right of the amplifier, you will find source, mute, record, menu, and enter buttons, and of course, volume control. Finally, front and center, the 2160 features an LCD display and navigation buttons for cycling through the amp's menu and options. Now, as Randy, my buddy, the cheap audio man, pointed out in his review, and I'll also echo this, the front buttons do feel a little bit on the cheap and plastic side of things, and while I had no issues while using the amplifier, I do feel the need to mention this, as I would hate keeping my mouth shut only to have one of you fine folks buy this, break a button, and now I'm out a Christmas card or two. Taking a look at the business end, and hang in there, we got a lot to chat about. The 2160 offers 4 single-ended RCA inputs, a selectable moving magnet or moving coil RCA input, main in and pre-out RCA jacks, not one but 2, bless you Outlaws, subwoofer make it happeners, and guess what? We're not done yet. An Ethernet jack, USB 2.0, 2 digital coaxial inputs, 2 optical inputs, and why not? USB accessory power jacks for 5-volt DC accessories. And of course, 5-way binding posts for speaker A or B, and yes, you can even run them both at the same time for those who are about to party. To the far right, you will find an IEC inlet for mains and a rocker switch for the master power. The unit is 17 inches wide, 5¼ inches high, and 15 inches deep, and weighs in at 28.3 pounds. At the time of this review, the asking price direct from Outlaw is 999 smackaroos, which, getting this out of the way right now, that price is more than fair for everything thrown in with this amplifier, and in my humble opinion, probably lower than what it should be. As I mentioned, the amp is Class AB and dishes out 110 watts per channel into 8 ohms. While not a high current design, it has been my experience that this amp does have the juice needed to wake up any speaker that I've reviewed over the last 3 to 4 months, and I would imagine has enough juice to wake up just about anything that I can think within reason. In the sound shed, I typically listen to music into the 80s with some dynamic peaks all the way into the 90s, and in that context, the Outlaw played every speaker that I've had without breaking a sweat and never sounded lacking in the low end, nor did it ever sound like it's hitting a brick wall of compression. So, hopefully this clarifies the first thing that I think a lot of folks will be curious about. The 2160 seems to be rock solid when it comes to power, dynamics, and the ability to manhandle most of the speakers that are going to be out there. For starters, and this isn't really well advertised by Outlaw, this amplifier can stream right out of the box. I mean, you're going to need to grab Outlaw's app, which is available for Apple and Android, but with this app, you can add a number of different streaming services such as Spotify, Tidal, Qobuz, Amazon Music, and more, and from there, off you go to the races. Now, for those who have other digital devices they want to add into the mix, as we covered before, you got a ton of different ways to pull this off. I ended up running my Inuos Zenith into the USB jack in the back of the 2160, which is labeled as PC USB. So with my Zenith, I can load Roon or configure it to work with Inuos Sense, which is their own software for music playback. Now, call me nuts or call me an audiophile, it's basically the same thing, but after comparing Roon to Sense a number of times, I think that the Inuos Sense app actually sounds better. I know that sounds a little bit crazy, but let's not get sidetracked because it doesn't have anything to do with what I'm about to say. When Roon is enabled, I can select the 2160 as my audio playback device and all is well. It works perfect. However, when Inuos Sense is enabled, I got nothing. Now, look, I doubt this is Outlaw's fault, and I'm not blaming them. In fact, the manual does mention that the rear USB jack is designed to work with Windows or Mac-based computers. So the reality is, my weird hiccup might be irrelevant, but knowing how many of you guys might be using some kind of an audiophile server like the Inuos, you might want to do some double checking before you hit the checkout button if you're going to be using that same USB port. So yeah, the 2160 is indeed a streaming amplifier. It has multiple digital connections, like we mentioned, to coaxial and to optical inputs, and indeed the rear USB, but don't forget a front-facing USB as well. Now, I did test the front-facing USB with tracks that I've loaded on a thumb drive. I felt like I was in 1997, like, hey guys, look at this sweet technology. You can put songs on this device and plug it in here and play it, but I don't know how many of you guys are actually, doing this. It's cool. I mean, it brought me back. It brought me back some memories. Either way, I had no issues with it. It works, and according to the manual, the Outlaw can support thumb drives up to 32 gigs. So obviously, with a digital brain and analog heart, there must be some kind of DAC inside of this thing, and sure enough, there is. The Outlaw features a Burr Brown PCM1792A digital to analog converter. And here's the thing. I'm actually pretty impressed with how this amp sounds with its own built-in DAC. I know that the newer Yamaha RN line is hell-bent on using the Sabre line of DACs, and to me, those sound just a bit forward and front row compared to the Outlaw, which to me sounds a bit more refined and perhaps mid-row. Actually, now is a good time to toss on some headphones and give this thing a quick listen before we move on to some other cool features.
Engineer, where are you headed?
No hubiera pensado que yo me iba a enamorar, jamás no quería saber nada más, nunca más.
So yeah, not a bad sounding unit at all, and the sound clip that you just heard is of the Radiant Acoustics Clarity 6.2. If you felt things sounded a little bit sharp on top, please take note that this speaker is a little bit more on the lively side, and I am recording on axis, where the ideal listening window for this speaker is closer to 30 degrees off axis. Either way, folks, I think the 2160 is drawing a straight line when it comes to its overall tone and overall bandwidth. Now, with that being said, if we're talking about imaging within the soundstage, I actually think that the recently reviewed Duke A5 sounds more impressive in that department, but of course doesn't have all the bells and whistles as the Outlaw. It's not even close. And in fairness, I should also mention it doesn't have the same level of control and grip at higher listening levels as the 2160. So in any event, the tone on this amplifier is linear sounding, which is a win. It doesn't sound super front row or forward, which is a win, but it doesn't offer the most insane imaging that I've ever heard. It's not going to blow your socks off like some of the best amps that I spent time with. It does the job, and it sounds pretty good. Now, pretty good is fine and all, but what if we were to, I don't know, think outside the box and get creative? So, of the many Swiss Army-like options on this amp, one thing that caught my attention is this amp offers both preamp outputs and main inputs. Now, we're going to go off-road here, and I got to admit it, I don't know how practical this really is unless you aren't afraid to roll up your sleeves and do some not-so-common audiophile tweaking. The preamp outputs of this amplifier would allow you to take the entire front end of this amp along with its feature set and of course connect it to any power amplifier that you have laying around. Now in this example, you could ditch the solid state section for tube amplifiers or heck, throw everything into Class A. Why not? The sky is the limits, and here is the kicker. With the mains input, we can do the exact opposite. That's right. Let's say you wanted to take advantage of the solid state power of this amplifier, but I don't know, happen to have a lovely sounding DOD audio tube preamp laying around, and oh, I don't know, happen to have a fancy pants Maydac laying around. Listen to me, folks. You are bypassing all of the amp's doodads in this scenario, which is like throwing away half of the stuff that you just paid for, but at the same time, you might get much better sound out of this thing. And if you don't believe me, headphones on, Junior. Let's rumble.
Engineer, where are you headed? Engineer, where are you headed?
No hubiera pensado que yo me iba a enamorar jamás. No quería saber nada más, nunca más. No hubiera pensado que yo me iba a enamorar jamás. No quería saber nada más, nunca más.
So in this example, we just heard a back-to-back comparison of the stock amp versus my DOD audio and Maydac handling the entire front end. And I gotta say, this mains input, which was a lot more common in the golden age of hi-fi, can be a lot of fun to mess around with. Of course, I'm not suggesting that everyone interested in buying this amp would also have a Maydac lying around, and while that's fair, let's look at this for what it actually is. It really doesn't matter what DAC or preamp that you have laying around. The fact is, you can and certainly should try plugging it into this thing and see what happens. So, there are indeed some interesting off-road avenues that one can take with the Outlaw, but at the same time, the practicality of that venture is a tough sell. So, let's back up for a second and discuss a couple more tools within the 2160's arsenal that can have an impact on the listening experience. The Outlaw does come with built-in EQ, and it has both bass and treble controls to make broadband adjustments. Taking a look at this in-room shot of the Clarity 6.2s, you can see by adjusting the bass up 10 increments at a time that you can essentially create a low-end tilt on the entire bottom end. Of course, decreasing the bass, again in 10 increments as well, you can pull the rug from underneath your speakers if you want. Same thing applies with treble. When increasing to max, you can enjoy the sound of dog whistling and snakes hissing all that you want, or you can go in the opposite direction and make your speakers sound like mud, if that's what you're into. Now, this EQ is not surgical, and from what I can see, it works more like a tilt EQ, which does have an impact on a lot of the bandwidth. However, we're not done yet, and with the front speaker EQ settings button, the 2160 does have a cool little trick that can beef up smaller bookies and help round out the bottom end. Take, for example, these little prototype speakers that GR Research and I have been collaborating on. While the bass does hit down into the 50s, and I think it's quite satisfying, there might be some folks who would want to beef up the bottom end a little bit more, and with the Outlaw, that's not an issue. With a small bump at 55 Hz, 65 Hz, or 80 Hz, you can lift the bottom end of any speaker and have at it. So here, headphones back on, let's run through some clips and I'll let you guys hear how this sounds with these speakers. But wait, there's more. That's right, Bob. Behind door number 3, the Outlaw also has the ability to do the opposite with the use of high-pass filters, which you can engage on the back of the unit through the use of bass management. And I should mention, not only is it pulling the bass off the backs of your mains, it's also creating the perfect slope if you happen to have 1 or 2, bless you Outlaws, subwoofer make it happeners connected to this thing. So yeah, feel free to forget the EQ on the plate amp and use the built-in curves on the Outlaw, set the frequency point to 55 Hz, 65 Hz, or 80 Hz, and just like that, your sub and mains are now shaking hands without breaking a sweat. I gotta say, pretty dang clever. And just when you think we might be wrapping this show up, the Outlaw also has a built-in phono section. Now, while this is starting to get to be a little bit more common with a lot of the integrated amps, I will say it's not so common to see both moving magnet and moving coil settings included. This is nice, and while I'd love to tell you that the built-in phono section is indeed the cat's pajamas, the truth is, I wasn't super impressed with what I heard. Dropping the needle on Mike Valentine's big band orchestra with the Goldring Ethos SE, it sounded to me like something was lacking in body and dynamics. To me, this cart, which sounded sublime on the recently reviewed PH 9.0 from Modrite, sounded sort of thin and even bright with the 2160. Of course, it's not exactly a fair comparison of a $4,000 Phono preamp, so I admit it, I am a bit spoiled, but digging around in the manual, I saw something that was kind of interesting. I took note that the loading impedance of both moving magnet and coil appears to be 47K. Now, I'm not smart enough to say if this is a problem, so I'll let you guys iron that out in the comments section, but to my ears, at least with this cart, the built-in phono section would maybe score a C- at best. Either way, I do wish that I had a moving magnet cartridge laying around to throw onto this thing, and in that example, it's entirely possible that my impressions would be quite a bit more enthusiastic, but alas, I digress. With the cart that I had to play with, the 2160's phono section left me wanting more. Well, folks, there you have it. And even with everything we have already talked about, we really just barely scratched the surface with the Outlaw. It does have a built-in FM tuner, internet radio connections, discrete headphone section, and more. But again, I wanted to get a little bit more granular with the features I think most of you folks would find most interesting, and of course, how it sounds. So, from a feature set perspective, it is really hard to pick a fight with the Outlaw, and combined with a decent sound signature and a fair price point, I can't think of a good reason not to recommend this amplifier, but at the same time, I got to admit that I feel a little conflicted. Maybe it's a nothing hamburger, and there are tons of people out there who would indeed use all of the stuff that the Outlaw offers, but the reason for the conflict that I'm feeling is pretty simple. For folks who would just want a great sounding amplifier without all of the stuff being thrown in, there are many other options out there, and many of them are cheaper. With the recent uptick in things like the Weem audio products or even Blue Sound, I can't help but wonder if most of you folks that watch my channel would actually prefer a simpler, smaller device that has better app integration. I'm going to be curious to hear what you guys think, and if indeed the Outlaw is the perfect amplifier for you. As for this cowboy, I gotta say, I like the sound of the amplifier. I think that the built-in DAC sounds nice. I like the fact that the amplifier doesn't sound bright or forward right out of the box. I like the speaker EQ settings and that little bump that it adds to bookshelves. I like the preamp and mains connections, and I had a blast going Frankenstein with all of that stuff. And I like the overall design and aesthetics of the amplifier, even though I know it's not for everyone. So yeah, for $1,000, if anything in that list of positives means something to you as well, I doubt that you're going to regret dropping the coin for the 2160 Mark II. And with that, I'll see you outlaw-loving audiophiles in the next video.